My name is Ellen Chang, just posting here. We are talking about some research that Public Spend Forum recently did, released about a couple months ago. I just put a link to some of that research in the chat. So I'm part of H4XLabs that works with a lot of deep tech dual use companies. We help you all commercialize, we help you scale. That's what we do. I'm particularly mission oriented in terms of my personal investment foray is really around national interest and how to de-risk our nation's critical areas. And so it's really great that we have Raj, who's recently looked at these emerging critical technology areas, and he's able to present some of the research that he's done. So that's me. So Raj, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and then I'll have Jason Kessler, who's part of STMD at NASA, introduce himself.
Great, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for having me here today. And great to be here with you and Jason in this conversation for a very important program, SBIR, STTR. We know it's an important program, so I'm excited to dive in a bit. By way of introduction, I am the CEO and founder of Public Spend Forum, which is a market and supply chain intelligence firm. And so we are specifically looking at emerging technology supply chains and markets, and helping both government as well as venture capital, private equity, and others really understand what the opportunities are and how to engage the market. So we'll dive a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Raj. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, Raj. Great to be with you all on this panel, and great to see the numbers keep increasing. Glad there's interest in this topic. I'm Jason Kessler, and I am the program executive for the NASA SBIR and STTR programs. Fundamentally, that means I lead the strategy, policy, and budget aspects of the NASA program. And so really looking forward to digging in with my fellow panelists and hopefully illuminating some through our conversation.
Yeah, so Raj, feel free to pull up any slides you have, and I'll kind of kick it off. So going through the report, you have some very interesting insights, looking at why certain companies may or may not accelerate, why certain companies may or may not be raising capital. Maybe there are some other indicators that you're seeing, like where we're underinvested relative to our priorities that we state we have. Would love for you to just kind of walk through what your findings are, kind of introduce folks to the report as a scene setter so we can have a richer conversation. So over to you. Great.
So the impetus for our work, and I'll look at some of my notes here, really started with as a firm, we're constantly looking at not just what's being invested in, right? Where's money being spent, what technology, what markets, and how do we bring buyers, sellers kind of together? But the most important question I think everyone has is, what are we achieving with this money, right? We start out with some goals for investments. I think Jason will speak to some of that, right? There's always some problem you're trying to solve. And then are we really able to solve these problems? And what types of technologies investments are helping us get to the end goal? So that was really the impetus. So when we started this work, we know that there's been a lot of analysis on different types of programs, including the SBIR program, on how much money is being spent, how many companies are moving from phase 1 to phase 2. But what we felt there was a gap in really the analysis was, one, really understanding what outcomes are we trying to achieve, which is a really complicated question. Two, maybe comes before that, is even the more basic question of what are we investing in? Not just how many dollars, how many companies, but which technology areas, what use cases are we investing for? So that was really the impetus behind our work, to start out and say, let's start with the basics. Where are we putting our money, right? Who's getting the money? Which programs are investing? Which regions do we see as emerging as potential innovation clusters? So those were some of the set of questions that we started with, Ellen, and we can dive in into some of those as we go.
Where are we putting our money?
Where are we putting? I think this was a surprise. We triple checked these numbers because first time I saw them, I said, "Whoa!" And let's go back and make sure. And then we've confirmed it since, and I think everyone generally who's looked at it agrees. So let me just pull up the report really quick, and then. So this is a report. I think if Donna, we could put up the link to the report. You can download it if you haven't looked at it already. This is the full version that's available now, but we have a preview version, about 45 pages still. And many of the slides I'll show you are from the preview version. So, so I think if I go back here, like I said, let me just put this in screen show. I don't intend for these to be read over here, but one thing we started with was, is there a proper definition? And Alan, when you asked the question, where are we investing the money? When we tried to do that, right, what we found is, and which we already know, and I think that there's no common definition of, for instance, what's trusted AI and autonomy, right? Department of Defense has 14 critical tech areas that have been outlined. CHIPS Act has 10 tech areas. NSTC has 18, and so on. Right? So there's no standard common way of looking across in many of these programs and priorities. So the first thing we did is we said we put our some of our AI and ontological work, without getting into how we did that, we basically used our technology, our AI, to be able to categorize and create standard definitions around all of these. So we took all those areas, and then we came up with 13 tech areas. And then we said, okay, now let's look at all the data and say, where is money being invested? So if you skip past that, what we see is, first of all, we just looked at 5 years, 2018 to 22. So we said, let's look at that. Let's start with that 5-year view and see what the trend looks like. So overall, we see that the program grew from 2.8 billion. Now we're only looking at, by the way, just the initial award. We're not looking at future obligations. So and sometimes the numbers are a little different if you look at different analyses, but they're generally in the same ballpark. So we went from 2.8 billion a year to 3.7 billion, so which is great, right? There's been criticism sometimes, I believe unfairly, of the SBIR program. We're not really, we just react to numbers and quick analyses, and we're not going deeper. So that's what we're trying to do here. So that's the macro view. And you can see that there's more and more money moving towards phase 2, it seems. We see there's a blip here, so we're still looking at a broader trend, but which is great if there are more and more SBIR from phase 1 moving to phase 2, which generally means, and Jason, you can speak to this, from kind of the initial R&D to more advancing and building prototypes and advancing the technology to phase 2. So still not full commercialization, but at least it's moving towards that. And then this chart is the one, I believe, the first time view that we brought to the table, where we didn't have a technology view to say, okay, what are we investing in? So you can see biotech by far, if you look across the total of the 5 years, is 6.5 billion out of the total 17 billion. So that's a big number. And after we dug into it, it makes sense because a lot of R&D and the cost of drug development, we already know, is very high. And so as we check these numbers, it made sense. But then this, I'd ask you to pay attention, including, these 5-6 categories here, they're kind of in the same ballpark, right? Between 2.1 and 1.7, generally in the same range, let's say. Everything from advanced materials and related manufacturing, so advanced manufacturing, et cetera, to advanced communication technologies, space technologies, right? And trusted AI and autonomy. In terms of which is growing, if I go one more chart, what areas, then the question is, which areas are growing? AI and autonomy we see has been growing, which makes sense again, because it's so cross-sectional, right? It's applied across everything, right? It's applied in space, it's applied in many defense applications, in energy. So it's grown by 250% over the past 5 years. Space tech, we know there's, again, I'll leave that to Jason to talk to, grown by over 100%. Advanced manufacturing, because of the focus on manufacturing, is grown by 85%. So you start to see the trend line there, and we can dive a little bit deeper Alan, I want to just pause here so we can get Jason kind of to speak to some of this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It is fascinating that the biotech dollar amount is that high, and now we have a specific emphasis from at least a couple new agencies focusing on biotech as well. Maybe to your point, Raj, maybe Jason, any initial reactions to the data? Does it make sense to you, given that you do run an SBIR program, and what are you trying to achieve with your SBIR program?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen and Raj. Real nice brief synopsis of the depth that you have in the report. I would say that it was not really a surprise. I think what was refreshing is the categorization and the thoughtful approach. And as Raj pointed out, inevitably, even within NASA SBIR specifically, we have cross-cutting that addresses multiple technology areas or mission directorates, if you will, or missions themselves. And so it will inevitably be very challenging to really get to granular understanding, but having general categories like that is super helpful. And I think what's interesting from a NASA perspective, really the civil space point of view, is that I left NASA back in 2001 the first time. And in 2023, the space economy and the entire sector is so radically different, and that the opportunity for small businesses to meaningfully contribute to the space mission is particularly exciting. And I think that's part of why I decided to come back in this role. Is I think there's a real opportunity to do meaningful work. And I simply think of advanced space leading the capstone mission, several SBIRs starting in 2017, and now they are flying around the moon in the near rectilinear halo orbit that the Gateway will be flying in. Orbit never been flown. 5 SBIR heritage companies a part of that mission as a precursor for the human Artemis mission back to the moon. So seeing the potential for small business to meaningfully contribute, at least in the civil space sector, it's good to see that increase of investment over time, because I think the opportunity, whether it's the tools or the finance or the community of support within the small business field, really makes it possible to see success. And one of the things that Raj and I have talked about in the past is that tricky part of understanding the long-term implications. Because my advanced space example, they started SBIR back in 2017. And in the NASA context, it's roughly 8 to 10 years of development, because we were really low TRL early stage. And seeing that commercial return can be a real challenge. And so seeing the pool of money across governments increasing is great for our businesses, because they can also go to Air Force, Space Force, NSF, DOE. And so there's good crossover potential as that pool of money is larger. So nothing really shocking, I would say, but refreshing to see the data in that context.
Thank you for that. I think continuing along the lines of scene setter, Raj, you actually did a breakdown of by agency. Who's the biggest spender? And if you let us know, I don't know if you can show the chart. What's interesting is the biggest spender may or may not be a biotech knowledgeable entity, and so I'm curious on the biotech number.
Let me go back to these slides. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, I think anyone can guess.
Yeah.
When we say DoD as a whole, right? Which is, of course, so that's not a very difficult. You can probably ask my 13-year-old; he'll tell you that. He's heard enough of my conversations over time. But what becomes more interesting is when you dive deeper. I think where when we look at that question about spending, the question goes back to action, right? What can we do with that? Besides saying, hey, here are the big agencies, great. Okay, the question that we're asking is, which programs are investing in the similar types of use cases, right? And then they can collaborate, right? And to try to solve the same problem, maybe, or at least take lessons learned, right? That's one way we're thinking about it. On the company side, I know there's a lot of companies and entrepreneurs participating here. The question is, which programs should I go to and talk to? So great, you can tell me NASA's investing, right? That doesn't do me very good if I don't know exactly where to go, who to talk to at NASA, right? And besides Jason, of course. And so that's the question we're asking. So if I flip through a couple of slides here, let me just put up. So what I'm showing you are macro views. We do have, for every one of the 13 categories, we have mini reports coming out. And that dives into which programs are investing, which companies are winning, right? So you can dive deeper. What I'm showing you is just the macro view right now. So you can see DoD, of course, being the largest, not a surprise, about 8.2 billion in that 17 billion total, with the Air Force within DoD being the largest, and then Navy. But then so there's a number of agencies you can see, again, based on the mission. I think, Jason, you just mentioned it, right? Depends on the program, the mission, and the goals, what types of use cases, and even, what are they starting kind of very early stage when we say, TRL level 3, right? Versus say 4 or 5. It depends, right? DARPA, for instance, you see in here, if you are kind of at the early stage, TRL level 2, 3, 4, that's where DARPA's most of their investments are going to be, given their mission, right? Whereas if you go, and same thing with, for instance, National Science Foundation here, right? But if you go out to others, like even Department of Commerce, EDA, or others, and NASA, even I'm guessing, Jason, and I haven't dived deep into that yet, but there's probably programs that are, there's a diversity of programs, and depends on the mission of the program. So I just want to point that out, for anyone who's looking at this. Then I think outside of DoD, I want to come back to this. HHS, of course, because of the biotech spend, is quite large. But then after that, you see Department of Energy, NASA. I was surprised by how big NSF's numbers are, but maybe it shouldn't be. So a lot of, and this is just, by the way, counting just SBIR. When you start adding grants to this, those numbers become really large really quickly. So these are kind of the larger agencies. You see the numbers go down very quickly after that, right? So it's kind of this cutoff right here.
So as you were looking at the see, what types of problems did you see? Like, were there any patterns in terms of problem sets or maybe emerging areas, and have those been changing?
Yeah, I to be honest, Alan, we're still digging into that a little bit, like in terms of, are there, we're doing trend analysis to say, are the use cases changing over time, right? And that's a little bit more complex, and we're diving into that a bit. But what I can tell you is, at a kind of a 5-year trend view or a 5-year view, first of all, this is just showing, it kind of makes logically sense, right? That biotech, of course, this is HHS right here, or right here. If you go to electronic warfare, it's a DoD category, so it's going to be all DoD. Whereas if you go to space here, 60%. I was actually surprised by this. There's still DoD, 60% here, and I know there's a lot of collaboration between Air Force and NASA. And so when you think about space, for instance, so some couple of surprises, at least for me, coming in. Energy, right? Department of Energy is 50%, then DoD. So you can kind of start to see, but again, it becomes more interesting when you start to go down at the program level, right? So one of the things we're doing within the category specific view, and Jason, I don't have the NASA one here right now as an example, but we're breaking down what programs are investing. By the way, there are 92,000 programs, okay? that we've documented now and standardized. 92,000. Okay, now if you imagine if you're whether a government trying to collaborate across programs, or you're a company looking to say, where's my product market fit? Who do I go talk to, right? And that's very central, by the way, to commercialization, right? That's a very core question. Where do I find the use cases and who has the same problem sets that I can solve? So what you can see is we're trying to start to dive deeper into, these are the bigger program offices. For instance, in DARPA, Microsystems Technology Office, not a surprise given focus on chips and CHIPS Act and semiconductors, et cetera, right? The Biotech Office, information innovation around AI, et cetera. So not surprises which program offices are larger. So that's one view. And then Ellen, coming to what you're asking here, then let me just go to, oops, sorry, I think I might have gone a little bit far here. So then what problems are we solving? We looked at, basically, when we looked at this data, and we're doing this across the board, not just for SBIR, but across the board for all types of programs. We want to know what problems are we solving for what types of use cases. So the way we've kind of thought about it is, what are the use cases? So typically you want to think about what are the outcomes, right? What are the use cases? And then what are the technologies being tested? So I'll give you a couple of examples here. One, for instance, object detection. Now you see some similarity with space here, space situation awareness, right? There's some parallel in the technology sets that we looked at, right? Because they're trying to do similar things, sometimes for different use cases, right? So this is a big part of, for instance, a lot of drone technology, right? FAA, we found some certain things around collision avoidance, some SBIRs and other awards related to that. I think, Jason, we saw in space a number of things around collision awareness, or I forget the exact terminology we have here. I'm looking at my notes. But space situational awareness was kind of a key area, and you can probably speak to this. Another area, for instance, Ellen, that we see is predictive maintenance, right? Now, predictive maintenance is high in DoD, but in a lot of places where there's equipment and uptime required, right? We're even looking at it, and we saw this actually come up in space again multiple times, because you need longer, very long cycle times or uptimes, right, in space. We saw this with batteries, for instance, battery technology. How can we maintain battery life for longer? So predictive maintenance is another example. If you look across the board, then I think the way we tried to look at it is, what verticals, right, are we most prominent in, and then what are the use cases within each one of those, and then what are the technologies being applied? So if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks for setting the scene, and maybe I'll go back and pull Jason into the conversation. You know, part of our preview with Raj yesterday was, we were, you know, given that you do have a SBIR program, how do you think about, you know, the topic areas or these different problem areas, and how do you choose them? And then, you know, because Raj's data is looking post, you know, and
yes,
essentially after it's all been decided. So how do you think about it? And do you tend to correlate or coordinate with anybody else?
Yeah, it is an interesting process, because most folks forget that the first A in NASA is aeronautics. So as a program, we cover the entire mission within NASA. So that's aeronautics, that's science, from earth science to heliophysics and astrophysics. It is space technology, and then the two components of human exploration, both exploration systems and space operations. And so we are in service of all of those different NASA missions. And so for the longest time, we had kind of a monolithic solicitation that we would source across the agency and find technical gaps that were considered viable for small business to respond to. And to Raj's earlier point, really focused on low TRL. We really maybe start around 2, 3. And if someone's pretty successful, they're getting up to 6 or 7 in most cases. And that is multiple awards, several post phase 2 awards to be able to de-risk, just because the space environment or even aeronautics is quite harsh. And so there are strategies within the agency that are trying to meet the various missions within our strategic objectives, and trying to find that sweet spot for small business to address that need. And recognizing that monolith doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that we have. We embarked on a new approach last year, and Ellen and your team have been fantastic in supporting our Ignite pilot, where we are looking to, rather than solely source NASA technical gaps, we are looking to find commercially viable products with companies that can springboard off of the NASA mission, but have more of a commercial focus. And in order to be successful, part of that pilot recognized that the solicitation and the whole selection process needed to be different. And so we, rather than having a 20-page technical volume or 20-page proposal, we added a pitch deck and a much shorter proposal, trying to meet the small businesses that are out in that commercial, venture world where they are. And so we're in year 2 of that experiment, trying to figure out how do we connect in new and different ways. Because one of the challenges that I'm sure everybody recognizes is that government procurement, and we're a contracting agency, government procurement is very strict in the way that it operates. And so currently, the way the NASA program works is we'll put out a solicitation in January, it closes in March, and we can't talk to anybody about what's in that solicitation. And so we have 90 subtopics that are out on the street that can be pretty specific, or maybe they're vague, but people don't have the ability to ask more to understand what's going on. And so looking and seeing what others are doing in terms of pre-solicitation work or opportunities to avoid a waste of time by firms in terms of putting in a proposal in when they don't necessarily know exactly what we need. We recognize that's something that we'd like to explore more of. And so this Ignite solicitation was a way to begin experimenting a bit so that we can engage the small businesses. And I think the other piece of that, and you've been instrumental in this, Ellen, you and your team, and in that pilot with Ignite, is have some community building events, these catalyst events where we bring together financial players, the small businesses, the subject matter experts, and understand, is there really a market opportunity here? Is there a topic that is worthy of our solicitation? And so we certainly don't have the problem solved, how best to engage the small businesses and how to ensure what we're funding then leads into program infusion or commercial success. But we're attempting to try to play with some of those parameters to increase what Raj was highlighting, and that's ultimately the outcome. So I sadly don't have as many advanced space stories. We've got a lot of great success stories to talk about, but I would love if our conversion rates, both to program infusion and really commercial success, were higher, and we were optimizing that. And so figuring out how we alleviate duplication, if it's a space work focused area or Air Force is focusing on something. We don't really have that problem with NSF because their program is just so different. They're really they don't have a mission that they're meeting other than to support the United States economy. And so they will fund a company once, and then they're really that initial seed to get them out and commercially successful. We have a very vibrant mission need, but the final thought on that I think small businesses that approach our program don't always recognize. They might think of the DoD context. We're a very small market. So small businesses that are coming to meet a NASA technical need, I have a colleague that likes to say it, like NASA will buy maybe 5. We'll buy 1 to bake, 1 to shake, 1 to break, 1 to put on the shelf, and 1 that will actually fly. Now, you all know that 5 units is not a viable business. And so figuring out how we can support the NASA mission need through our program, but also enable the businesses to find that there's also customers outside of us, critical for us to be successful in our program. And I've been talking to a firm. They're in a 2E and they've proven themselves quite successful, but now they're having trouble finding additional follow-on funds. And I think the importance of understanding that customer base and really working the market as you're in development, even into phase 1, is a critical component. And that's why we're supportive of I-Corps, both in phase 1, phase 2, and in our post phase 2. So long-winded answer, Ellen, but a lot to unpack in that question.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think a lot of folks are actually within the space sector, so probably appreciate some of your comments. In fact, we do have all of, a bunch of small businesses and startups online. So maybe y'all want to populate the chat with some suggestions, ideas, thoughts in reaction to what was just said. And that way you have a chance to actually influence NASA right now. What I can
Ellen,
offer
I can react. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, let me just finish here. What I can react, since Jason did ask the question, interested in pre-solicitation. I work DoD quite a bit. What's fascinating about their 3 cycles a year is that they release the topics, then they have 1 month worth of open period to go barrage all the TPOCs with all the questions. And I feel the small businesses and companies don't know how to use that time very well. And then it closes down. Whereas NASA's is a little bit more just abrupt, hey, we can't talk anymore. May I offer that? But go ahead, Raj.
No, I think that's so important. I think there's so much to unpack, Jason, and what you just went over. I think a couple of things. Really appreciate, the way that you're going about engaging the market and looking at kind of what solutions there are. It goes back to, I think, the issue of the fundamental thing that we're trying to create as a company is market transparency. And if there are other people solving the same problem, right? And there are companies out there. I'll just use one quick example, Ellen. A case study I read, a long time, a Harvard Business Review case study I read, 15 years ago when working on innovation, right? And it was about, if we all are aware of the magic eraser and what is it called? The magic eraser that Procter & Gamble has to take away all the stains and everything. It does work like magic, right? Procter & Gamble spent years, maybe a decade in their R&D labs trying to solve that problem. And they spent hundreds of millions, if not billions, I forget the exact number. They put out a scientific brief and it somehow got to a small city in Japan where there was an entrepreneur, a scientist who had already created a solution that was being used locally. Somebody made them aware. They flew out there. They bought the patent. They bought the technology, and they were able to commercialize it. What they had spent over almost 10 years trying to solve. I think it goes back to, I think, the need for this kind of visibility, and why we think, digging in, one, understanding what commercial solutions are out there already. Somebody's trying to solve something. Which government programs, and so I think are already working on similar set of problems, right? I think that's what becomes really important, and that's why we're spending a lot of time on this, because there's likely something out there that can speed up then, Jason, the end goal of, right, solving the problem and outcomes. So that's our ultimate goal here.
I think part of what I often think about is, especially if we're looking at commercialization, there's a timing aspect to commercializing technology. There has to be enough adjacent technologies that are also maturing at the same time in order for a technology to actually hit the tipping point and commercialize. And oftentimes we think about a specific technology, but we don't look at all the other stuff. For example, the silicon, the chip world is looking at new materials outside of silicon. If the software that actually designs those chips, if the test equipment that is used on those chips don't change in order to assume the new material, it stays locked, right? Like graphene doesn't become the next material of choice, right? So there's these complex technical ecosystems have to be thought about. That's kind of my own personal journey and looking at some of these problem sets. I'm going to,
and I'll just double down on that, Ellen, because I think what I was alluding to, at least in the civil space sector right now, why it's so exciting is because we're seeing more adjacency. So we're seeing launch costs come down and we're seeing multiple launch providers. And so now the access to space problem is getting solved. And so now it's the use in low Earth orbit and then geo. And then as we push to the moon, seeing other government agencies being a part of cislunar. So I think the tricky spot then becomes like, where do you, what components? Because at SBIR, we're $150,000 phase one, $850,000 phase two. That's component level technology. So how do we ensure that we are choosing the right components that are going to aggregate up into systems level change? But I think, again, the adjacency of where we find the space sector now is particularly exciting. And I don't know that we'll ever surpass the bio that we see in Raj's investment, but maybe in the not too distant future, we see us eating way into that sizable lead that the bio has on us.
yeah, absolutely. Maybe all the people have to go into space and therefore you adjust the total market. Kind of like drugs, although there are certain drugs that only address a very small sliver of the population. But I like where you're going there. I'm going to transition to some of the Q&A that folks have popped into the Q&A section. So I'll just read verbatim here. But at some point, I'll get to specific NASA, SBIR, STTR questions. But at any rate, from one person, a lot of great technology is being developed through SBIR, STTR phase ones and phase twos, but government agencies aren't tracking them as a whole. Maybe this is where Raj is going, and often release RFPs for technology the government has already invested in via an SBIR, STTR. How does the government track, or is that, Raj, what you're building? Maybe either of you can answer that question.
Jason, please go ahead. I wonder how you track, and then I can answer what we've seen.
Yeah, I'll say I give kudos to SBA because they've done a fantastic reboot of their site. And so it's because we are all the agencies are responsible for uploading our awards to the SBA so that they can track. And so the website's much more user friendly than it has been in the past. And so I think it's a great resource. I think to the heart of the question though, it's like building that habit. I will be honest, and I think most scientists and engineers in a particular field are pretty confident in their knowledge of the system or their sector pretty well. And I would posit that I think things are moving so quickly that there does need to be more of an external look. And so part of what we were attempting in Ignite are these catalyst events to build community around topical areas. And so I think circling back on this thread is that the data is there at SBA, but it's, are we getting our subject matter experts to actually use it to ensure that as they're thinking about a subtopic, that they're mining the already invested technologies, which in the NASA case with Air Force, DOE, well, all of the DoD components, like there's great overlap. And so I think that's inherent on me and my program to encourage and support and question the solicitation subtopics to ensure that there's consideration of what is already out there has been invested in. But we do see some bit of transition where NASA will pick up a phase 2 from another agency, or other agencies will pick up from us as well. So, but certainly haven't solved that problem as well as we should.
It's also a challenge, I feel, in that if you seed a technology, it's really, one needs to think through how much dollars is it to take to get that technology matured. And that's not necessarily the amount that the SBIR phase 1 and phase 2 provide, right? There's a journey there that might take another $10 million. We don't know. And so the duplication is not totally bad. Sometimes it is, and you're not supposed to propose and get paid for the same thing. at least what you're not supposed to do. But there is kind of a reason for some duplication. Yeah, Raj, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think you know, a couple of things, and what we are seeing, and I think what's valuable here is, one, you know, if we just look at the same technologies, who's investing in them, right? But I think if we come at the question a different way, also goes, and it starts with outcomes, use case technologies, right? If we turn that and flip it on its head to say, I'll give you an example of predictive maintenance, what we saw in the data, right? And there's multiple types of technologies being used for predictive maintenance, improving that. So the outcomes being, we want to increase equipment uptime. We want to increase warfighting readiness. Okay, and those are the ultimate outcomes. They're hard to measure, but those are, right? So predictive maintenance is one way to do it rather than just keep bringing new equipment, right? Keep uptime. Now, two types of technologies that are being tested that we're seeing, right? One is around AI and kind of predictively saying, hey, at what point should we be, there's certain issues coming up, et cetera. There's, right, AI and kind of prediction algorithms. Another is around advanced manufacturing, right? How can you quickly replace a part? Now, so those are two different types of approaches to the same use case and the same set of outcomes, right? So the question that we're also looking at is saying, how do we solve these problems? Like, which one is better? Maybe we need a whole litany in the beginning. We do believe we need a portfolio of approaches, right? You don't want to limit yourself right at the beginning, right? But then at some point, where do you start to see that, you know, the evidence, let's say, that one approach is better, or maybe still a combination of approaches. So I think in all of this, that's, if I think the last point I'll just make is from a commercialization standpoint, if we're looking at it, it's such an important question too. We see one of the key issues with commercialization, there's a number of factors that obviously, you know, go into, I know Alan, you and I talked about this, commercialization. So it's not that's a whole separate discussion we could set up a webinar on, right? But one point I'll just make is one of the barriers is the visibility into use cases and who has them, right? And that's one of the struggles we see both for programs. When we talk to DARPA, for instance, they say, okay, we have got something that we think has some application, but we don't know all the programs across government that may have this problem. Then who do we? Same thing on a company, right? I've got a product, I had a great SBIR, right? We knocked it out of the park. Where else do I take it, right? Now, there might be commercial applications as well. So just wanted to leave it at that.
No, those are great insights, and I feel something to ponder for those who've asked the question. I'm going to ask this one from someone about technology development. So, can you address technology development companies who have a longer path towards commercialization, i.e., good science needs more support to bring the science into applications? I think I kind of alluded to that with certain dollar amounts needed. How do we think about that, maybe, is the question? Or what's the evidence in the data? Is there any of you, either of you, want to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump on it first and let Raj pick up. One of the things that we've noticed and we added to our program is a larger value post phase 2. Because to your point, Ellen, for us at the end of a phase 2 SBIR, that's roughly 2.5 years. That's $1 million. You're not flight ready. Like no NASA program is going to put you in the critical path. And in the case of advanced space, they were like 5 or 6 awards. And it's not duplicate in terms of what they're doing, but it's pieces of the overall solution that get funded. And so what you end up getting at the end of that is a viable system level solution. But we added some post phase 2 larger dollar value because we recognize the need to further de-risk and get buy-in from programs where those technologies will land. And so the 2 clear examples of success in those instances, Proto Innovations got a slip control software for a lunar rover, the Viper mission, that'll be hopefully flying later this year, if not early next. That was a large sequential for us, post phase 2 investment that then led to the phase 3 for the Viper mission, because it became critical path and we were able to de-risk that enough for the flight mission to consider it. And so I was in a conversation recently with somebody from NIST manufacturing extension program, like trying to figure out what are the ways that we can do to help further de-risk, because again, getting to phase 2, you don't necessarily, and I've heard this example specifically, a company had a wildly successful phase 2, and then the flight program thought, great, we're gonna use this technology. And then it took them another $6 million and at least a year, because the company didn't have materials knowledge or manufacturing knowledge to get it to flight ready hardware. And so figuring out what those additional valleys of death are and how do we bridge those is only going to get more and more important as we look at federal budgets that are only going to tighten. And so I think the insight where there is the duplication across agencies is going to be really critical, so that we're not wasting valuable resources on the same early stage, and that we have money available for that later investment for higher TRL to actually get to, in the NASA case, flight hardware that then becomes attractive for commercial as well. So that's a perspective, and one that we're struggling with because our budgets are limited and we'd love to have more post phase 2, but you know, it's if you put too much in post phase 2, then we're not bringing the fresh ideas at phase 1 in. So
hey Jason, I think one thing, and we can talk offline, that we've been looking at that's interesting is we're seeing kind of, is there a relationship between, you know, I'm kind of my data analytical geeky side comes into this, is looking at sequencing of investments. So one thing we're seeing is that, you know, like what are the capital, basically as a company, if you're a company on here, right, how do you use the phase 2 to be able to go to venture capital and create a multiplier effect off of that, right? And how do we do that, not wait till phase 2 is over? So we're actually looking at some case studies to say, we know these companies are successful and what's the causal relationship? And so we're looking at that in terms of, you know, at what point did they go out and start marketing their phase 2 as an example, or and use it to raise money and create a multiplier. We've identified over 100 case studies to dive into to really try to understand that. But I think that's an important thing, because you're right, government, and that's the other, you know, discussion we had with the National Economic Council members at the White House, is the multiplier effect in the private capital is so important to commercialization. we cannot fund full-scale commercialization. I think Ellen, you said that too earlier, right? There's only X million dollars we're going to fund through SBIR phase 2 and 1, right? And so where does private capital come in addition to, say, programs of record in the, DoD, et cetera?
One just quick build on that, and want to make explicit at the same time that we're attempting in Ignite, our pilot that we're working with Ellen and her team. And we've seen at phase 1, great buy-in, like letters of commitment from funders at phase 1. We don't ever see that. And so we're getting the commitment, and that's coming because we're finding a topic area that's juicy and ripe for funding that also meets a NASA need. But the point I wanted to make is I don't ever want us to be completely 100% that way, because we serve a broad mission as a program for the agency. And so we will continue to experiment and figure out how do we align and potentially have those baton handoffs between funders to ensure that there's a viable path for success. And there's also going to be inevitably the stuff that we're doing ideation work on with small businesses to see, is there a radically new way of observing planets around other stars that's just not going to have a near-term commercial win. And so for me, the trick is, what's that right balance? Like, how do we ensure that we're meeting the NASA mission and ensuring we're also seeing the commercial success of the small businesses, and figuring out what that sweet spot is really what I'm endeavoring to try to do in the near term. So
I feel the space segment is probably the most unique with some of these maybe dual, like deep tech areas that at least government invests in that the commercial sector is growing quickly, even with far out ideas. And perhaps that might be, because the billionaires of the world are coming into the market and are spending money there, but also because there's a national security aspect that's causing additional money to have to come in, right? Because there's a little bit of a competition across the world. So that's the fastest, I guess. And so folks building for space, there might be ways to tap other types of funding coming into the sector to actually benefit. The challenge is figuring out the timing of when that tipping point will happen. Having done investments before, it's great to be first. It's terrible to be first, because when you're first, you actually run out of money. We've had 2 companies that were doing asteroid mining probably 10 years ago, right? Planetary Labs, and then Deep Space Industries, and they both were just too early. It's too early. But we got at least Dan Faber coming back at it again. So Raj, any parting, like kind of last minute parting shots here, and then Jason, I'll invite you to, and then we'll close out the webinar, making sure we're allowing folks to get back to their next meeting.
Yeah, no, thank you, first of all, Ellen, for hosting this conversation. Yeah, I think there's a lot more work to be done. That's what I can say in terms of just diving deeper in some of the issues that we've discussed. But I do think, if we can really focus on first answering the question of what before we get to the outcomes, because that's a question that NSF and others are asking. What outcomes are we generating? And the question we've gone back to everyone and said, we don't even know what we're investing in. First, how can we talk about, that's the second question, right? We got to start with where's our money going? And then we can talk about what are we, so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if we can continue to dive deeper, especially understanding, I will keep stressing this, because we've seen others come back to us and ask this question over and over, use cases, right? Because that's the linking point. It's not the agency level, it's not the program level, it's the use case, right? I have this use case, you have this technology that melds together on the use case, right? Or if there's collaboration. So that's what I would just leave it at, is let's keep looking for where there's collaboration opportunities? What are the programs for use cases? And as we dive deeper, I think we'll create more opportunities like this. And then the second point is around commercialization, which I think I'll leave to another webinar. But that's such an important question. We are doing some work around predictive and looking at patterns and data that potentially tell us, what's the opportunity? Is there kind of a regression model that can tell us, there's an opportunity, higher opportunity for commercialization versus others. So
that's interesting. Jason, did you want to add?
Yeah, it's great, really great feedback from Raj. I think the direction I will go, given that it seems like there are a bunch of small business entrepreneurs online, and it ties in with what Raj was saying around commercialization. Like, recognize if you're going to go the SBIR route that it's super competitive. We get roughly 1,500 proposals for 300 spots. And then from there, we have about 40% win rate from phase 1 to phase 2. So it's really, really competitive, and it takes a long time because we're working on deep tech, really challenging problems, like how do you get gears to work in the lunar night? And those don't always or often translate well to a terrestrial market. And so trying to figure out what your commercialization pathway is going to be. Like, again, I think Raj's point of like, what is the outcome? What change in the world are you going to be delivering is super important. And recognize, like, our mainline solicitation is a 20-page technical proposal with 1,500 applicants for 300. Like, that's challenging. Now, is that worth your time and energy? Because we'll only have 5, we might only buy 5 units. And so really being clear on what your long-term goals are, and recognizing that if you do endeavor to come through at least the NASA SBIR STTR program, it's a long-term commitment, because again, we look to 8 to 10 years till we're starting to see TRL levels high enough for real commercial success. So patience and determination. And then I guess the final thought, because I've been dealing with this firm that is at a 2E and now they're struggling to find funding. It's never too early. Like, it ties into that commercialization mindset. Like, ensure that you're use I-Core to understand your market and find where you're going to be able to be successful. Because even at the end of a 2E, now we're talking probably $2.5 million invested. It's not clear where that company goes now, and that's an awful shame, because the market work hasn't been done.
Gotcha. Maybe you can chat with them. But thank you both for your comments. What happens, just for the audience still online, is we're going to provide the recording. We have notes, a transcript, et cetera. That all goes out to everyone that register, not just folks who attended. And from there, we'll follow up with both Raj and Jason, so that we do have some information, or I guess I'll tease out the data that we collected based on some of the comments and questions that you've made, so that you have them. Thank you so very much. We'll see everybody in our next, next webinar in about a month. Talk to everyone soon. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.